For German tank crews, the Panzer was more than just a machine. It was a symbol of superiority, a tool that had driven through the plains of Poland, the fields of France, and the frozen steppes of Russia. Every scar on its armor, every grinding track across foreign soil, was a testament to its dominance. These men, battle-hardened veterans of countless campaigns, believed that within the steel walls of their tanks they were invincible. The Panzer was the embodiment of Germany's military might, a towering fortress that no enemy could penetrate and no artillery could breach. From the first thunderous roll across Poland in 1939 to the vast campaigns in the Soviet Union, the Panzer was an instrument of fear. For the men inside these steel beasts, their very identity was tied to the idea that they were an unstoppable force. Russian T-34s had been formidable opponents, yet they were nothing compared to the German juggernaut. The same could be said of the French Char B-1 or the British Matilda. None of them, with their primitive anti-tank weapons, could pose a serious threat to the Panzer's thick armor. The crews had survived countless artillery barrages, their tanks shaking under the strain of hits that never seemed to do any real damage. But even more than the armor, it was the tank's mobility and firepower that made it the undisputed king of the battlefield. A German tank commander would stride confidently into combat, knowing that his machine, equipped with a powerful cannon and near-impenetrable protection, could obliterate any opposition in its path. To German tankers it was clear: no infantry, no artillery, no tank could match the power and precision of their panzers. Then came whispers from the front, low, almost dismissive murmurs at first, news of a new weapon, an American invention, they said, a crude, laughable thing, hardly worth considering. It was a tube carried on the shoulder of a lone infantryman, a simple bazooka. German officers scoffed at it. They called it a novelty, the product of desperation. After all, who could believe that a mere man, armed with what appeared to be a primitive rocket launcher, could pose a threat to their mighty panzers? Yet as the reports from Italy began to trickle in, the dismissive attitude of German command began to falter. The first confirmed encounters with the American bazooka shattered their preconceived notions. Tank after tank, once thought to be invulnerable, was reported destroyed. The weapon was no longer a joke, it was a threat. The first shocking realization hit home when a report from the Italian front described a lone soldier with a bazooka, lying in wait amid the rubble of a destroyed town, bringing down an entire tank with a single shot. What had once been inconceivable was now undeniable. A Panzer, a tank designed to withstand the worst of artillery, had been defeated by a single rocket from a soldier hidden behind a crumbled wall. The reports were grim. Small, seemingly insignificant infantry teams, armed with these toy weapons, were taking out German tanks at an alarming rate. What was more disturbing than the loss of the tanks themselves was the psychological toll it began to take on the crews. This was not just a military threat, it was an emotional and psychological attack. Inside the Panzer, the once immovable confidence began to waver. German tank crews had been trained to expect to face enemy tanks, artillery, and aircraft. They had been taught to fear the firepower of the Soviets, the Allies, even the desert storms. But now their biggest fear wasn't something visible on the horizon. It was something far more insidious, an invisible enemy, hidden in the shadows, armed with a simple weapon that could shatter their world in an instant. The myth of invincibility was cracking. For the first time, German tank crews began to question their own safety. The once clear superiority of their tanks over all adversaries now seemed fragile, and every road, every village, every corner became a potential death trap. As the months wore on, the reports from the front lines grew more disturbing. German tank commanders, once confident in their machine's ability to dominate the battlefield, were forced to confront a growing sense of vulnerability. What had begun as an isolated incident in Italy soon became a widespread problem. The Panzers, once regarded as symbols of unstoppable might, were now being brought down by a weapon that seemed, at first, too simple to pose a real threat. But the truth could no longer be ignored. The bazooka was not just an inconvenience, it was a menace. The first time a German tank was struck by a bazooka, the crew inside was left stunned. There was no warning, no distant rumble of enemy artillery or the telltale flash of an incoming tank shell, just a sudden, violent impact that rocked the entire machine. The Panzer lurched and the smell of burning fuel filled the air. For the crew, it was a moment of sheer disbelief. They had been hit by something so small, so seemingly insignificant, and yet it was enough to disable their mighty machine. It wasn't just the damage to the tank that shook them. It was the realization that their once impenetrable fortress had been pierced by a weapon carried by a single infantryman. There were no grand battles, no clashes between titanic war machines. This was a new kind of warfare, one where the enemy was not always visible, where danger lurked around every corner, and where the battlefield itself became a psychological trap. The tanks, those once feared instruments of destruction, were now at the mercy of soldiers hiding in the shadows. German officers, who had once dismissed the bazooka as a passing novelty, were now forced to reckon with the reality of the situation. They sent out orders to adjust tactics, but it was already too late. The fear had begun to spread like wildfire through the ranks. Tank crews who had once charged into battle with unshakable confidence now found themselves hesitating. The very tactics that had made them successful, rolling across open fields, exploiting terrain to their advantage, no longer seemed safe. Every corner of every village, every hedgerow, every doorway became a potential threat. Tank commanders now issued orders to avoid narrow streets, to stay out of towns where the risk of ambush was too high. But even in the open, there was no safety. The fear of the bazooka could not be avoided. German tank crews had been trained to spot enemy tanks from a distance, to brace for incoming artillery, but now they had to worry about the tiniest of threats, a single soldier hiding in the rubble, waiting to strike. The first official reports that made it back to German command were filled with disbelief. Tank after tank, even those with reinforced armor, had been disabled by the seemingly insignificant bazooka. Some were destroyed outright, others were left stranded, their engines crippled or their tracks torn apart. German engineers scrambled to analyze captured bazookas, searching for some way to counter the new threat, but there was little they could do. The bazooka was small, portable, and had the ability to pierce through armor at close range. It was a new breed of weapon, one that made the Panzer's thick steel seem irrelevant. As the weeks passed, the reports from the front grew more alarming. In Normandy, where the hedgerows provided perfect cover for American infantry, the bazooka became an even deadlier weapon. Tank crews, once accustomed to rolling across open fields, found themselves creeping down narrow lanes, their senses on high alert. A single flash of flame from a concealed position could spell the end for a Panzer. And yet, despite their best efforts, the Germans could not escape the growing fear that this new weapon was slowly but surely turning the tide against them. As the summer of 1944 raged on, the landscape of Normandy became a graveyard for German armor. The once-proud Panzers, which had charged through open fields with the confident roar of their engines, now found themselves trapped in a world of shadows. The terrain was no longer a battlefield of wide, open spaces where tanks could maneuver and spot enemies from miles away. Instead, the thick hedgerows, sunken lanes, and twisting roads of Normandy created a suffocating maze that seemed to close in around the German forces. For the first time, German tank crews found themselves feeling the grip of claustrophobia as the very earth seemed to conspire against them. What had once been the perfect terrain for the Panzer, vast, open fields that allowed for swift, aggressive movements, now became an unforgiving jungle of earth and foliage. The hedgerows provided perfect cover for American infantry teams armed with bazookas. The German tanks, once kings of the battlefield, now became prey. Every corner, every piece of rubble, every break in the terrain became a potential ambush point. The psychological toll on the German crews was immediate. No longer could they trust in the open fields to give them the advantage. Now, every road, every village, every turn held the possibility of death. In this new reality, the tactics that had once made the German tanks so fearsome became liabilities. Tank crews had been trained to push forward, to advance aggressively and crush the enemy beneath the weight of their armor. But now, hesitation crept into every movement. Every time they entered a town, a village, or a narrow lane, they were on edge. Their eyes darted constantly, scanning every corner, every shadow. It wasn't just the threat of enemy tanks or artillery that they had to worry about. It was the fear of a single soldier, crouching behind a wall, ready to unleash a rocket that could pierce through their armor and send them to a fiery grave. The bazooka had shifted the balance of power in ways the Germans had never anticipated. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a psychological weapon. The fear it instilled in German tank crews was far more devastating than the damage it inflicted on their machines. Even when a bazooka shot missed, the shock of the impact, the deafening blast, and the knowledge that the next shot might hit were enough to rattle even the most battle-hardened veterans. The fear of the unseen enemy began to spread like wildfire through the German ranks. In the face of this new threat, German commanders began to issue new orders. Tanks were now to avoid narrow streets, to stay away from built-up areas where the risk of a bazooka attack was highest. Instead of charging forward with the same aggression they once had, tank commanders were now instructed to move cautiously, to avoid getting too close to potential ambush points. They began to deploy infantry screens ahead of their tanks, hoping to protect their machines from the hidden threat, but this only added to the sense of unease. The German tanks, once unstoppable juggernauts, now felt like vulnerable prey being stalked by invisible hunters. The hedgerows of Normandy provided the perfect setting for this new type of warfare. Tanks, accustomed to having a clear line of sight and the ability to outmaneuver their enemies, found themselves trapped in a maze. The American infantry, armed with bazookas, had the perfect advantage. They could strike from almost any position, disappearing into the dense greenery before the Germans had a chance to retaliate. The shock of being hit without warning was devastating to the German crews. They no longer felt in control. The battlefields that had once been their domain now seemed like a hostile, unpredictable environment. Every moment was filled with fear. Every turn was an uncertainty. Every corner was a potential death trap. Veterans of the conflict later recounted how even a missed shot from a bazooka could be enough to make their hearts race with fear. They knew that the next shot might be the one that pierced through their tank's armor, sending them to a fiery death. For the first time in the war, German tank crews began to doubt their superiority. The fear of ambush, the constant uncertainty, began to gnaw at their morale. They no longer felt invincible. Instead, they were just one unlucky shot away from becoming another casualty in the brutal, invisible war of Normandy's hedgerows. By the late months of 1944, German tank crews were forced to confront a new and even more insidious threat, an entire class of American vehicles designed specifically to hunt down and destroy tanks. These were the tank destroyers, and they were unlike anything the Germans had expected. Whereas the German military had always believed in the power of heavy tanks to crush their enemies, the Americans had begun to deploy vehicles designed not to engage in traditional tank-to-tank duels, but to outflank, outmaneuver, and destroy their armored behemoths from unexpected angles. The M10 Wolverine was the first to appear, followed by the M18 Hellcat and the M36 Jackson. These tank destroyers were lighter than the standard Sherman tanks, with thinner armor, but they carried powerful guns capable of punching through the thickest German armor, including the feared Tiger and Panther tanks. The concept was simple but revolutionary: speed and firepower over heavy armor. These vehicles sacrificed protection to become nimble and quick, capable of darting across the battlefield to exploit gaps in the enemy's defenses before disappearing into cover, leaving their German opponents scrambling to respond. For the German tank crews, these new vehicles were nothing short of terrifying. Unlike the familiar threat of enemy tanks, which could be seen from a distance, these tank destroyers appeared out of nowhere. The first time many German tank commanders encountered the M10 Wolverine, they were stunned by its range and the sheer volume of fire it could deliver. A single M10 could move into position, fire several rounds, and vanish before the German tanks even had a chance to react. But it wasn't just the firepower of the tank destroyers that unnerved the Germans. It was their ability to outmaneuver even the heaviest German tanks. The M18 Hellcat, with its astonishing speed, could race across open ground, outflank a Panther or Tiger, and deliver a deadly blow to its vulnerable side or rear. Survivors of such encounters later described the Hellcat as a ghost. It would appear out of nowhere, fire a few rounds, and then vanish before the Germans had any opportunity to return fire. What made the Hellcat even more deadly was its speed. Unlike the lumbering German tanks, which were built for heavy frontal engagements, the Hellcat could strike quickly and retreat before the Germans could bring their superior optics and heavier guns to bear. For the German crews, the sudden appearance of these fast-moving, highly mobile tanks was like fighting a phantom. They could hear the roar of engines, see the flash of fire, but by the time they turned to face the threat, it was already gone. But perhaps the most terrifying of all was the M36 Jackson. This tank destroyer carried a 90mm gun, powerful enough to destroy even the thick frontal armor of the Tiger tank. For German crews, encountering the M36 Jackson was like facing a nightmare. The M36's long-range firepower meant that German tanks could be destroyed from distances where they once believed they were safe. The Jackson's 90mm gun could punch through the armor of even the heaviest German tanks, rendering their protective shells irrelevant. The first time German tankers encountered the M36 Jackson, many of them were struck by the sudden realization that their tanks, once considered the most advanced machines on the battlefield, could no longer be relied upon to withstand every threat. What had once been a battlefield dominated by German tanks, where the panzers had ruled with an iron fist, now seemed like a game of cat and mouse. The Americans had found a way to level the playing field, and the Germans were no longer the ones in control. The tank destroyers did more than just destroy tanks. They shattered the myth of German technological superiority. For years, the Germans had prided themselves on their heavy armor and advanced weaponry. Their tanks were designed to dominate, to crush all opposition beneath the weight of their firepower and protection. but now they found themselves being hunted by lighter, faster, and more maneuverable vehicles that used speed, firepower, and tactical ingenuity to destroy them. The psychological toll on the German crews was profound. The sight of an M10 Wolverine or an M36 Jackson appearing out of nowhere, firing its powerful gun, and then disappearing before they could react, left tank crews feeling helpless. It wasn't just the destruction of their machines that terrified them. It was the realization that the Germans' once unquestioned superiority in tank warfare had been shattered. What made these encounters even more humiliating for the German crews was the knowledge that they were being hunted not by other tanks, but by vehicles designed specifically to destroy them. The very nature of tank warfare was changing before their eyes. The Germans, who had once been the ones setting the pace, now found themselves scrambling to adapt to a new and ruthless form of combat. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. For the Germans, this new class of weaponry signaled a shift in the nature of war itself. No longer was it a battle of tanks versus tanks. It was now a battle of tactics, mobility, and precision. And in this new game, the Germans were at a severe disadvantage. The rise of the tank destroyers marked the beginning of the end for German armored dominance. As the battlefronts in Western Europe grew more intense, the Germans found themselves facing not just the brute force of American tanks, but a coordinated system of warfare that exploited every weakness in their armor. The sheer number of Shermans, combined with the lethal precision of the American tank destroyers and bazooka teams, created a battlefield where German tank crews were no longer the hunters, but the hunted. The psychological burden was growing heavier by the day, as German forces realized they were being systematically outmaneuvered and overwhelmed. The Americans, with their superior coordination, quickly adapted to the tactics employed by the Germans. Rather than engage in a straightforward duel of tanks versus tanks, the Americans began to employ a more sophisticated strategy, one that combined speed, surprise, and the combined efforts of infantry, tanks, and anti-tank units. It was no longer just a matter of battling enemy tanks head-on. It was about setting traps, drawing German tanks into kill zones, and overwhelming them from multiple angles. One of the most effective strategies employed by the Americans was the use of infantry with bazookas in combination with the mobile tank destroyers. While the Sherman tanks pushed forward, drawing the attention of German tank crews, the tank destroyers, such as the M10 and M36, would move into position behind the enemy lines, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The Germans, focused on the advancing Shermans, often found themselves caught off guard when the tank destroyers appeared from unexpected angles, striking their flanks and rear with devastating accuracy. The coordination between American units became a nightmare for German commanders. No longer could they rely on their superior tanks to break through enemy lines with the same confidence they once had. Every movement was now filled with uncertainty. The Germans, who had once prided themselves on their ability to execute lightning-fast strikes, found themselves bogged down in a slow, grueling battle of attrition. Each attack seemed to end in failure, each advance followed by another ambush. It wasn't just the firepower of the Americans that was causing problems, it was their ingenuity. The American forces had developed a system of layered defenses that made any advance into enemy territory a perilous proposition. Tank destroyers positioned at key points, combined with bazooka teams hiding in the shadows, created a battlefield where German tank crews were no longer safe, no matter how many enemies they destroyed. Even when a tank managed to break through the first line of defense, it was often met by a second, and then a third wave of attackers, all ready to take their shot. For the German tankers, this was a terrifying realization. The old tactics, the strategies that had worked so well in Poland, France, and Russia, were no longer viable. Every advance was now met with the fear that a tank destroyer, a bazooka team, or a hidden infantryman might be waiting just around the corner. The Germans, once confident in their ability to outthink and outfight their enemies, were now struggling to keep up with the constantly evolving American tactics. As the months went on, the German morale continued to deteriorate. Tank crews who had once been the pride of the German military were now increasingly hesitant and unsure of themselves. They had been trained to face the enemy head-on, to engage in direct combat, to overwhelm opposition with superior firepower. But the battlefield had changed. It was no longer a place where the strongest tank won. It was a place where coordination, speed, and adaptability reigned supreme. The Germans, for all their technological superiority, were being outsmarted at every turn. The realization that the battlefield had shifted was a blow to the German psyche. They were no longer invincible. They were no longer the undisputed masters of armored warfare. Now, every advance, every maneuver was filled with doubt. Tank commanders, once confident in their ability to lead their units to victory, began to hesitate. They second-guessed every decision, fearing the invisible enemy lying in wait behind every corner. The impact on the German tank crews was profound. The once feared panzers, symbols of German strength, were now being destroyed at a frightening rate. The tank destroyers and bazooka teams had turned the tables on the Germans, making them question not just their tactics, but their very understanding of warfare. They were no longer the superior force on the battlefield. They were being outplayed by a force that used innovation and cooperation to exploit their weaknesses. This shift in the balance of power had a ripple effect throughout the German military. Officers began to realize that their tactics, built on years of blitzkrieg strategies and the use of powerful tanks to dominate the battlefield, were no longer sufficient. It was no longer enough to rely on sheer strength. The Americans had shown that in war, flexibility, adaptability, and coordination were just as important as firepower. The Germans, for the first time, were forced to confront the reality that they were no longer the ones dictating the pace of the war. The slow collapse of German confidence was a direct result of the constant pressure they faced from the American forces. No matter how many Shermans they destroyed, no matter how many tank destroyers they fought off, there was always another one waiting. This relentless pressure wore down the German tank crews, leaving them physically and mentally exhausted. The fear of being ambushed, of being destroyed by an unseen enemy, became a constant companion on the battlefield. As the war dragged on, the Germans' once unshakable belief in their technological superiority eroded. They had built their reputation on the invincibility of their tanks, but now, against the coordinated, flexible tactics of the Americans, even the mighty panzers were falling short. The winter of 1944 brought with it one final gamble from the German High Command, a desperate push to break through the Allied lines in what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. It was to be a do-or-die offensive, a last-ditch effort to reverse the tide of the war. German tank crews, battered and bruised, were thrown back into action, armed with their mighty panzers and driven by the belief that a bold assault could divide the Allies and force a negotiated peace. But what they did not anticipate was that the very land they once believed would offer them cover would become their greatest enemy. The dense forests of Belgium and Luxembourg, blanketed in snow, provided the perfect setting for a surprise attack. As the Germans began their offensive, their tanks surged forward, their massive guns roaring through the winter silence. For a moment it seemed as though the Germans might actually succeed. American units were caught off guard, and German tanks once again rumbled across enemy lines, pushing the Allies back, but the respite was short-lived. The Americans, however, were not the same force they had been just a year prior. The previous months had seen a steady evolution in their tactics, and now, in the icy forests of the Ardennes, they would put them into action with deadly precision. The Germans, who had once been the masters of surprise and speed, found themselves trapped in a nightmare. The terrain, which had seemed perfect for their tanks to exploit, now became a death trap. The snow, the fog, and the dense woods all combined to obscure their vision and hinder their ability to maneuver. Every advance felt like a step into the unknown, where danger could strike from any direction. It wasn't just the weather and terrain that worked against them. The Americans had adapted, learning from the experiences of previous battles. Tank destroyers like the M18 Hellcat and the M36 Jackson, which had once terrified the Germans with their speed and firepower, were redeployed into the region. These vehicles, already feared for their ability to strike at the flanks and rear of German tanks, now had the advantage of terrain. The M18 Hellcats, with their blistering speed, could dart between the trees and strike with lethal accuracy, while the M36 Jacksons, with their powerful 90mm guns, could destroy even the mightiest German tanks at long range. The Germans, caught in a seemingly endless trap, were now fighting not just American tanks, but an entire system of anti-tank weapons that worked in unison. Tank destroyers, infantry with bazookas, and even artillery worked together in a coordinated assault that left the German crews scrambling for cover. Every advance, every breakthrough, was met with counterattacks from multiple directions. The Germans, who had once relied on the shock and awe of their blitzkrieg tactics, now found themselves being picked off one by one, with no safe route forward. What made the situation even worse for the Germans was the sense of helplessness that took over their tank crews. The once proud panzers, so feared on the open battlefield, were now vulnerable in the narrow, winding roads of the Ardennes. Even if a tank managed to survive the initial wave of attacks, it was often met with another ambush, another tank destroyer, or another bazooka team waiting to strike. The Germans, who had once been the predators, were now being hunted with ruthless efficiency by the Americans. Perhaps the most crushing realization came when the German crews discovered that even their heavy tanks, the Tigers and Panthers, the pride of the German military, were no longer invulnerable. The M36 Jackson, with its 90mm gun, could pierce through the thick armor of the Tiger tanks, something that had once been thought impossible. The Americans, who had been dismissed by the Germans as inexperienced, were now fielding weapons that not only matched, but exceeded the firepower of the German tanks. As the Battle of the Bulge ground on, the Germans found themselves fighting not just the Allied armies, but their own diminishing morale. The once feared panzers were now symbols of vulnerability, their crews paralyzed by the constant fear of ambush. The sense of invincibility that had fueled the German army for so long had been shattered. The tanks, once seen as the pinnacle of military technology, now seemed like outdated relics in a battlefield where speed, precision, and coordination were the new keys to victory. The psychological toll was devastating. German tank crews, already worn down from months of grueling combat, began to crack under the strain. Their confidence, once unshakable, had been eroded by the constant threat of American anti-tank weapons. It wasn't just the loss of tanks that wore them down, it was the fear, the dread, the sense that every movement they made was a step closer to being destroyed by a weapon they couldn't see and couldn't avoid. The battlefield, once filled with the roar of German tanks, was now haunted by the specter of American firepower, and the Germans knew it. By the end of the Battle of the Bulge, the once-proud German armored divisions had been shattered. The offensive, which had been meant to turn the tide of the war, had failed catastrophically. For the German tank crews, the loss was not just military, it was psychological. They had gambled everything on one final push, and they had lost. The realization that their once formidable panzers could be destroyed with such ease by American weapons, once thought to be inferior, left a deep scar on their psyche. In the months that followed, the Germans would never fully recover from the shock of the Bulge. The psychological damage of the battle, compounded by the relentless effectiveness of American anti-tank tactics, would linger long after the war's end. The once feared panzers were now obsolete in the face of a new kind of warfare, one that relied not just on firepower, but on coordination, innovation, and adaptability.